She believed herself untouchable, until a human pinned her against the wall. The air in the docking bay of the Icarus smelled of recycled oxygen and the sharp, metallic tang of cooling ion engines, a stark contrast to the sterile, floral-scented atmosphere Liara was accustomed to on her home world. She smoothed the front of her shimmering gown. Her kinetic shield hummed a low, nearly imperceptible frequency around her skin, a translucent barrier that ensured no unrefined surface or common hand could ever graze her person. Across the deck stood Silas, a man whose presence felt like a structural anomaly in the refined architecture of the station. He was thick-shouldered, his skin tanned and scarred in ways that suggested a life lived entirely outside the safety of energy fields. Liara watched him through narrowed eyes, her posture rigid and regal, her chin tilted up to signal her natural dominance over a species that still relied on muscle and bone. "The transport is ready, Your Highness," Silas said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very deck plates beneath her feet. "You are late, human," Liara replied, her voice cold and melodic like the chiming of glass. "Space is big, and my ship has a temper," Silas shrugged, his eyes scanning her from head to toe with a blunt, honest curiosity that her shield couldn't deflect. "Your ship is a relic, much like your methods," she retorted, stepping toward him, expecting him to yield the path as all others did. He didn't move. Silas stood his ground, forced her to stop inches from his chest, where the heat radiating from his body was so intense it actually triggered a minor flare in her kinetic sensors. She felt a strange, prickly sensation in her chest, a reaction to his proximity that she couldn't categorize. "Relics still get the job done when the lights go out," Silas murmured, leaning down slightly so they were eye to eye. The alarms began to scream before she could formulate a scathing rebuttal. A hull breach in the sector sent a violent tremor through the floor, throwing Liara off balance. Her shield flickered as it compensated for the sudden shift in gravity. Before she could recover, Silas reached out. He didn't ask permission. He grabbed her upper arm, his fingers sinking into the soft flesh above her elbow, dragging her toward the airlock. For the first time in her life, Liara felt the direct, unmediated pressure of another living being. It was terrifying, and it was the warmest thing she had ever known. Inside the cramped escape shuttle, the silence was heavy, broken only by the frantic thumping of Liara's heart. She sat on the edge of a narrow bunk, her hands trembling as she smoothed her disheveled hair. The kinetic shield was dead, drained by the emergency dampeners of the pod. She felt exposed, as if her very soul were naked to the elements. Silas was at the console, his large hands moving over the manual overrides with a dexterity that seemed at odds with his rugged appearance. The orange glow of the emergency lights caught the sweat on his neck, making the muscles there glint like polished bronze. "You touched me," Liara whispered, her voice lacking its usual authority. "I saved you," Silas countered, not looking back, his focus entirely on the navigation screen. "No one touches a daughter of the High House. The shield is our sanctity," she said, standing up and walking toward him, driven by a sudden, inexplicable need to be closer to that heat again. "Your sanctity was about to get sucked into a vacuum, Princess," Silas grumbled, finally turning to face her. The shuttle was small, barely 6 feet across. As she approached, Silas stood up, and suddenly the space felt microscopic. He loomed over her, his shadow swallowing her whole. Liara looked up at him, her breath hitching. Without the shield, she could smell him, a scent of salt, wood smoke, and something primal. It was intoxicating. She reached out, her fingers hovering near his chest, wanting to know if his skin felt as solid as it looked. "Is this what humans are, just heat and friction?" she asked, her voice dropping to a breathy thud. "We are whatever we have to be to survive," Silas said, his gaze dropping to her lips. He moved then, a predatory grace that caught her off guard. He stepped into her personal space, his chest brushing against the fabric of her gown. Liara backed away, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, until the small of her back hit the cold, padded wall of the shuttle. Silas didn't stop. He placed his hands on the wall on either side of her head, pinning her. The sheer physical presence of him was overwhelming. He was a mountain of a man, and she was trapped in his valley. "You've spent your whole life behind a wall of light," Silas rasped, his face inches from hers. It kept me safe. It kept me pure, she managed to say, though her knees felt like they were made of water. It kept you numb, he corrected, his eyes burning with a sudden, fierce intensity. He shifted his weight, his thigh pressing between hers, a bold claim of territory that sent a jolt of electricity straight to her core. Liara gasped, her head falling back against the wall. She should have been offended. She should have struck him. Instead, her fingers curled into the rough material of his flight suit, pulling him closer. The human capacity for physical expression was a revelation. He wasn't using words or telepathy. He was using his mass, his pulse, and the terrifying strength of his grip to communicate a desire so potent it threatened to consume them both. "Tell me to stop," Silas commanded, his voice a low growl against her ear. I cannot," Liara confessed, her eyes fluttering shut as his lips grazed the sensitive skin of her neck. The sensation was like a solar flare. Every nerve ending in her body, long dormant under the protection of her technology, screamed to life. Silas moved with a deliberate slowness, his hands sliding down the wall to her waist, his thumbs hooking into the belt of her gown. He pulled her flush against him, and the contact was so total, so absolute, that Liara felt her mind fracture. Humans didn't just inhabit space, they dominated it. They filled every void with their will and their warmth. "You're shaking," Silas noted, his hands roaming over the curve of her hips. "I have never felt so much," she admitted, her breath coming in short, jagged gasps. "This is just the beginning," he promised, his mouth finally finding hers. The kiss was a collision. It wasn't the polite, distant exchange Liara had imagined of lesser species. It was a conquest. Silas tasted of iron and longing, his tongue demanding entry with a persistence that mirrored the human spirit. She met his hunger with her own, her hands traveling up his back, feeling the play of powerful muscles beneath his suit. She was a princess of 1,000 stars, but in this moment, pinned against a vibrating bulkhead in a dying shuttle. She was simply a woman being claimed by a man who refused to acknowledge the boundaries of the universe. As the shuttle drifted through the debris field, the interior temperature began to rise. Silas pulled back just an inch, his eyes dark with a hunger that made Liara's blood sing. He reached for the fasteners of her gown, his fingers nimble despite their size. One by one, the closures gave way, exposing the pale, shimmering skin of her shoulders to the dim light. She watched him, her heart thumping against her ribs as he took in the sight of her. "You are more beautiful than any star I've navigated by," Silas said, his voice thick with emotion. "Then guide me," Liara whispered, her voice a plea. He didn't hesitate. Silas lifted her as if she weighed nothing, his strength a silent testament to the gravity of his world. He laid her back onto the narrow bunk, his body following hers down, a heavy, welcome weight that grounded her in a reality she had never dared to explore. The friction of their skin against each other created a heat that the shuttle's heaters could never match. Liara felt the calluses on his hands as he explored the curves of her body, each touch a new map of sensation that she eagerly memorized. "Humans are extraordinary," she sighed, her fingers tangling in his dark hair. "We just know what we want, and we don't let anything get in the way," Silas replied, his lips moving down her sternum. The revelation hit her then, in the midst of her pleasure. This wasn't just about desire, it was about the fundamental nature of humanity. They were a species that moved through the world by touch, by impact, by the sheer force of their physical being. While her people had ascended into the ethereal and the technological, humans had remained anchored to the flesh, finding a power in it that her kind had forgotten. Silas was showing her that the greatest strength wasn't in the shields that kept the world out, but in the courage to let the world in. The shuttle groaned, a deep structural protest that vibrated through the bunk. Silas froze, his head snapping toward the console. The romantic haze cleared instantly, replaced by the sharp, cold clarity of a survivor. He rolled off her, reaching for his discarded tunic in one fluid motion. "We have a problem," he said, his voice no longer heavy with lust but sharp with command. "What is it?" Liara asked, sitting up and clutching her gown to her chest. "The debris field is denser than I thought. We're being pulled into the gravity well of the moon," Silas explained, already back at the controls. "Can we jump to light speed?" she asked, joining him at the front of the pod. Not without manual stabilization of the thrusters, and those are on the outside of the hull, Silas said, his jaw set in a grim line. Liara looked out the viewport. The moon loomed large, a scarred gray sphere that threatened to swallow their tiny craft. She saw the sparks flying from the external thruster assembly. It was a suicide mission to go out there without a tether, especially with the ship spinning as it was. I can do it, Liara said, her voice steadying. No, it's too dangerous, Silas snapped. My kinetic shield. I can reroute the emergency power from my gown's backup cells to my internal dampeners. It won't be a full shield, but it will keep me pinned to the hull, she explained, her mind racing through the technical specifications of her royal attire. Silas looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time he saw not just a princess, but a partner. He nodded slowly. All right, but you have 30 seconds before the atmospheric entry starts to cook us, he warned. Liara stepped into the tiny airlock. She felt a surge of adrenaline, a human sensation she was beginning to recognize. As the outer door opened, the vacuum tried to pull her out, but she activated the localized dampeners in her boots and gloves. She crawled across the vibrating hull, the stars a blur of motion above her. She reached the thruster assembly and saw the jammed valve. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, a strength born of the heat Silas had ignited in her, she wrenched the valve open. The thrusters fired, the sudden kickback nearly throwing her off. She scrambled back into the airlock just as the first wisps of orange fire began to lick at the edges of the shuttle. The door slammed shut, and Silas was there, pulling her into his arms as the G-force of their acceleration slammed them both against the floor. You did it, he gasped, his face pressed against her neck. We did it, she corrected, her heart racing. They survived the descent, the shuttle skipping across the upper atmosphere before stabilizing in a low orbit. The crisis had passed, but the tension between them had only deepened. Liara looked at Silas, her eyes bright with the thrill of the hunt and the heat of their shared survival. She realized that she didn't want her shields back. She didn't want the distance. Silas, she said, her voice low and purposeful. Yeah, he looked up, his face smudged with soot and sweat. The 30 seconds are over, she whispered, stepping toward him once more. He didn't need any more encouragement. He caught her by the waist and lifted her onto the console, his hands sliding up her thighs with a renewed hunger. The controls beeped and flashed beneath her, but neither of them cared. In the vast, cold emptiness of the galaxy, they had found a sun between them. You're not untouchable anymore, princess, Silas murmured, his breath hot against her skin. I never want to be again, Liara replied, her legs wrapping around his waist. The lovemaking that followed was a symphony of human ingenuity and alien awakening. Silas moved with a relentless, rhythmic power, his body a machine of pleasure that Liara learned to operate with her own newfound sensuality. She discovered that she could match his intensity, her own body responding to his touch with a fervor that surprised even him. They were two different worlds colliding, creating a new star in the wreckage of their old lives. Hours later, as they lay tangled together on the floor of the pod, watching the moon pass beneath them, Liara felt a peace she had never known. The silence was no longer empty, it was full of the sound of Silas's breathing. What happens when the rescue teams find us? She asked, her head resting on his chest. I guess I go back to being a mercenary, and you go back to being a princess, Silas said, though he tightened his grip on her. No, Liara said firmly, sitting up and looking him in the eye. A princess commands, does she not? She asked with a playful smile. I suppose so, Silas grinned. Then I command you to stay with me. I have a feeling the High House could use a little more. Human friction, she said, her eyes dancing with mischief. Silas laughed, a rich, warm sound that filled the small space. He pulled her down for one last, lingering kiss. I think I can handle that, he said. As the first rescue beacons began to flash on the sensors, Liara looked out at the stars. They seemed different now, less like distant points of light and more like destinations. She had been a creature of the void, protected and cold. Now she was a creature of the earth, warm and alive, and it was all because a human had had the audacity to touch her. The rescue ship, a sleek Xandarian cruiser named the Isla, docked with their pod with a soft, mechanical thud. When the hatch opened, a contingent of royal guards stepped in, their armor gleaming, their kinetic shields humming with a familiar, sterile energy. They stopped in their tracks at the sight of their princess. Liara was standing next to Silas, her hand firmly entwined with his. Her gown was torn, her hair was a mess, and her skin was flushed with a glow that no energy field could replicate. "Your Highness, are you harmed?" The lead guard, a stern woman named Shock, asked, her hand moving toward her weapon as she eyed Silas. "I have never been better, Shock," Liara replied, her voice ringing with a new, vibrant authority. "The human. He has violated the sanctity of your person," the guard stammered, looking at their joined hands. "The human has saved my life, and he has taught me more about our universe in a few hours than your tutors did in 20 years, Liara said, stepping forward, pulling Silas with her. Silas stood tall, his expression unreadable, but his thumb traced small, reassuring circles on the back of Liara's hand. He didn't flinch under the gaze of the armed guards. He was a man who had faced the vacuum and won. A few energy pikes weren't going to intimidate him. "We are returning to the capital," Liara announced. "And Silas will be traveling in the royal suite," she added, leaving no room for argument. The journey back was a blur of protocol and hushed whispers. The crew of the Isla watched them with a mix of horror and fascination. Liara ignored them all. She spent the hours in the suite with Silas, the two of them watching the warp streaks outside the window. They talked for hours, not about politics or war, but about the small things. Silas told her about the oceans of Earth, about the smell of rain on hot asphalt, and the way the sun felt on a summer afternoon. Liara listened, captivated by the sensory richness of his world. "It sounds heavy," she remarked after he described the crush of a crowd in a human city. "It is, but that's why we value the quiet moments so much," Silas explained, pulling her into his lap. When they arrived at the capital world of Altira, the greeting was even more polarized. The High King, a tall, imposing figure named Zora, waited on the landing dais. He looked at his daughter, and then at the man beside her, and his eyes narrowed. "Liara, what is the meaning of this?" he demanded. "Father, I have brought an ally," she said, her voice steady. "A mercenary, a human," the king scoffed. "A man who knows how to break shields," Liara replied, her gaze meeting her father's. "And a man who has shown me that our species has become a ghost in its own empire," she continued. The king looked ready to explode, but he paused, seeing the change in his daughter. She wasn't the compliant, distant princess he had sent away. She was vibrant, she was present, and she radiated a physical confidence that was entirely un-Xandarian. He looked at Silas, who gave a respectful but not subservient nod. "We will speak of this in the council," the king finally said, turning away. That night, in the opulent safety of the palace, Silas and Liara stood on a balcony overlooking the glowing spires of the city. The air was perfectly filtered, the temperature exactly 72 degrees. It felt dead. "You don't belong here," Liara said, turning to him. "I know," Silas admitted. "Then we will leave," she decided. "You'd give all this up, the power, the luxury?" he asked, surprised. "It's not luxury if you can't feel it, Silas," she said, reaching out to cup his face. "I want to see your world. I want to feel the rain," she whispered. Silas smiled, a slow, predatory thing that made her heart skip. He backed her against the marble railing of the balcony, his hands finding the small of her back. The city lights twinkled below them, but the only thing that mattered was the heat between them. "The rain is cold, Liara," he warned. "Then you'll just have to keep me warm," she challenged. The escape was easier than they expected. With Liara's knowledge of the security codes and Silas's ability to improvise, they were on a long-range scout ship before the sun rose. As they cleared the atmosphere and headed for the jump point to the Sol system, Liara felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She looked at Silas at the helm, his hands steady on the controls. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, glancing back at her. "I was born ready," she said, using one of his human phrases. As the ship surged forward into the infinite black, Liara reached out and touched the console, then her own arm, then Silas's shoulder. Everything felt real. Everything felt sharp. She was no longer a princess of a dying, distant empire. She was a woman of the stars, traveling with the man who had taught her how to truly live. The universe was wide, and for the first time she was going to feel every single bit of it. Silas watched her, a quiet pride in his eyes. He had come to the sector for a payday, and he was leaving with a revolution. He knew the road ahead would be hard. The Xandarians wouldn't let their princess go easily, and the human colonies were a rough place for a royal. But as he looked at Liara, her face lit by the glow of the jump drive, he knew they would be fine. Humans were experts at survival, and now they had something worth surviving for. "Next stop, Earth," Silas said, reaching out to take her hand. "Next stop, home," Liara agreed, leaning into him. The jump drive engaged, and the Icarus vanished into the fold, leaving the cold, shielded world of the Xandarians behind in a trail of human fire.